Marie Dubois never imagined her morning coffee would taste different because of events happening thousands of miles away in Niger. As she sat in her small apartment in Lyon, watching the news on her tablet, the 34-year-old nuclear plant worker felt her stomach drop. The headline read, "Niger suspends all uranium exports to France." Marie had worked at the Bougie nuclear power plant for 8 years. She knew exactly what this meant. France got nearly 40% of its uranium from Niger, and her plant relied heavily on this African nation's supply. Without uranium, the nuclear reactors that powered 70% of France's electricity would slowly begin shutting down. Across the city, Pierre Laurent was having his own moment of realization. The 52-year-old factory manager at a major aluminum smelting plant had just received a call from his supervisor. Electricity costs were about to skyrocket. The cheap nuclear power that had made French manufacturing competitive was about to become much more expensive. Pierre's factory employed 280 people. They produced aluminum components for car manufacturers across Europe. The business model was simple: use France's abundant cheap nuclear electricity to power the energy-intensive smelting process. But that model was about to collapse. Meanwhile, in the small town of Marcoule, where France's nuclear fuel processing facility operated, engineer Sophie Chen was staring at spreadsheets that painted a grim picture. The 28-year-old had been tracking uranium supplies for 3 years. She knew the numbers by heart. France consumed about 8,000 tons of uranium annually. Niger supplied 3,200 tons of that. Australia and Kazakhstan could increase their exports, but not quickly enough to fill the gap. Sophie's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues. Everyone was asking the same questions. How long would current stockpiles last? Could they find alternative suppliers? Would France have to reduce its nuclear power generation? The crisis had been brewing for months. In Niger's capital, Niamey, President Mohamed Bazoum had been overthrown in a military coup. The new military government, led by General Abdourahmane Chiani, had different ideas about how Niger's natural resources should benefit the country. For decades, French mining company Areva, later renamed Orano, had extracted uranium from Niger's mines in Arlit and Imuraren. The company paid taxes and royalties to the government, but many Nigerians felt they weren't getting their fair share. The uranium that powered French cities left behind environmental damage and communities that remained poor, despite sitting on valuable resources. Back in France, the reality was setting in at the highest levels of government. Energy Minister Agnès Pannier-Runacher called an emergency meeting. Around the conference table sat representatives from EDF, the state-owned electricity company, nuclear fuel companies, and industrial associations. The discussion was tense. EDF's representative explained that while France had strategic uranium reserves, they would only last about 2 years at current consumption levels. Industrial representatives warned that higher electricity costs would force manufacturers to relocate production to countries with cheaper energy. Marie's supervisor at the Bougie plant called a staff meeting that afternoon. The mood in the room was somber as he explained the situation. No immediate job cuts were planned, but everyone needed to prepare for difficult months ahead. Some reactors might need to reduce output. Maintenance schedules might be extended to conserve fuel. After the meeting, Marie called her husband, Jean, who worked at a nearby automotive parts factory. His company supplied components to Renault and Peugeot. They both understood that if electricity costs rose significantly, both their jobs could be at risk. That evening, Pierre sat in his office long after his workers had gone home. He was calculating how much the factory's electricity bill might increase. Even a 20% rise would eliminate their profit margins. A 50% increase would make the operation completely unviable. He thought about the 280 families who depended on the factory for their livelihoods. Sophie, meanwhile, was working late at her desk, trying to model different scenarios. Could France increase uranium imports from Canada? Yes, but Canadian mines were already operating at capacity, and expanding production would take years. What about reopening old French uranium mines? Possible, but those had been closed because they were no longer economically viable when cheap African uranium was available. The human cost was becoming clear. France's industrial competitiveness had been built on abundant, cheap nuclear energy. Industries like aluminum smelting, steel production, and chemical manufacturing had located in France specifically because of low electricity costs. These were good-paying jobs in regions that had few other economic opportunities. As night fell across France, millions of people remained unaware of how dramatically their lives might change. The lights still turned on when they flipped switches. Their factories still hummed with production. But in government offices, corporate boardrooms, and nuclear facilities, people like Marie, Pierre, and Sophie were grappling with a new reality. The uranium crisis wasn't just about mining contracts or diplomatic relations. It was about communities, families, and the delicate global web that connected African mines to French nuclear plants to European manufacturing centers. In Niger, the decision to halt uranium exports wasn't made lightly. The military government faced pressure from citizens who had grown frustrated with seeing their natural resources benefit other countries, while local communities remained in poverty. The uranium mines in northern Niger had operated for over 40 years, but the surrounding regions still lacked basic infrastructure, like reliable electricity and clean water. As Marie prepared for bed that night, she wondered what her job would look like in 6 months. Would she still be monitoring reactor systems, or would she be looking for work in an entirely different industry? The uncertainty was the hardest part. She had built her career around nuclear energy, believing it was France's future. Now that future seemed far less certain. The uranium crisis was just beginning, but its effects would ripple through French society in ways that nobody could fully predict. From the nuclear plants that dotted the countryside, to the factories that formed the backbone of French manufacturing, everyone was about to learn how dependent they had become on a small, landlocked country in West Africa that most French people couldn't locate on a map. 3 weeks after Niger's uranium export ban, the first cracks began appearing in France's industrial foundation. Pierre Laurent arrived at his aluminum factory to find a notice from EDF, the National Electricity Company. Power rates would increase by 15% starting next month, with further increases likely. Pierre stared at the document, running calculations in his head. His factory consumed enormous amounts of electricity to melt aluminum at temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Celsius. A 15% increase would cost the company an additional €200,000 monthly. The thin profit margins that kept 280 people employed would disappear entirely. Across the industrial Rhone Valley, similar letters were arriving at factories, smelters, and chemical plants. The region had become Europe's manufacturing hub precisely because of France's cheap nuclear electricity. Now, that advantage was evaporating. In the small town of Salandres, ceramic manufacturer Claude Moreau was facing an impossible choice. His family had run the pottery business for 4 generations, producing high-end ceramics that required kilns operating continuously at extreme temperatures. The electricity bill, already 60% of his operating costs, was about to become unsustainable. Claude employed 45 people in a region where alternative jobs were scarce. His workers weren't just employees, they were neighbors, friends, people whose children played together at the local school. The thought of laying them off kept him awake at night. Marie Dubois was experiencing her own crisis at the Bugey nuclear plant. Management had announced the first reactor would reduce power output by 20% to conserve uranium fuel. This meant fewer shifts, reduced overtime, and eventually, job cuts. Marie's department, which monitored reactor operations, would shrink from 12 people to 8. The psychological impact was as devastating as the economic one. Marie had spent years training for her specialized role. Nuclear plant operators couldn't simply transfer their skills to other industries. If France's nuclear sector contracted significantly, thousands of highly trained workers would find themselves unemployed with limited options. Sophie Chen, the fuel engineer at Marcoule, was working 18-hour days trying to secure alternative uranium supplies. Her contacts in Australia were helpful but realistic. Increasing uranium production required new mining licenses, environmental approvals, and years of development. The global uranium market simply wasn't designed to absorb sudden supply disruptions of Niger's magnitude. Kazakhstan, the world's largest uranium producer, was already selling most of its output to China and Russia. Canada's mines were operating at capacity. Even if every alternative supplier maximized production, France would still face a significant shortfall for at least 3 years. The crisis was spreading beyond heavy industry. In Lyon suburbs, small businesses were discovering their electricity costs were tied to industrial demand. As factories reduced operations, the overall electricity grid became less efficient, spreading higher costs across all consumers. Bakery owner Fatima Benali noticed her monthly electricity bill had jumped 30%. The ovens that baked fresh bread for her neighborhood consumed power around the clock. She couldn't reduce operating hours without losing customers to supermarket chains, but she couldn't absorb the higher costs either. After 15 years building her business, Fatima faced the prospect of closing. The human stories were multiplying across France's industrial regions. In Dunkirk, steelworker Antoine Roussel learned his plant would shut down 2 of its 5 blast furnaces. The company couldn't compete with German and Italian steel producers, who still had access to cheaper energy. Antoine, 47 years old with 2 children in university, suddenly faced unemployment after 23 years at the same plant. Government officials were scrambling to manage the crisis. Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne announced emergency measures, including subsidies for energy-intensive industries and accelerated approval processes for renewable energy projects. But everyone understood these were temporary fixes for a structural problem. The French public was beginning to grasp the situation's severity. Television news featured daily reports from struggling factories and worried workers. Opinion polls showed growing concern about energy security, with many French citizens learning for the first time how dependent their country was on African uranium. In Niger, the effects of the export ban were also becoming apparent. The mining towns of Arlit and Imuraren, which had depended on French uranium operations for employment and economic activity, were experiencing their own hardships. Workers at the mines faced uncertain futures as operations scaled down. Aissatou Mamadou, a 32-year-old nurse at Arlit's hospital, had mixed feelings about the uranium ban. She understood the government's desire to get better terms for Niger's resources, but she also saw how the economic disruption was affecting her community. The hospital, partially funded by mining company taxes, was struggling to maintain services. Back in France, Pierre Laurent made his dreaded announcement. The aluminum factory would lay off 60 workers immediately, with more cuts likely if electricity costs continued rising. The meeting with his employees was one of the most difficult moments of his career. These weren't just workers. They were people he had watched develop professionally over years. Sylvie Petit, a 44-year-old quality control technician, listened to Pierre's announcement with growing dread. She was the primary breadwinner for her family, supporting 2 teenage children and her elderly mother. The aluminum factory was the largest employer in their small town. If it closed completely, the entire community would collapse. Marie's situation at the nuclear plant was deteriorating as well. EDF announced that 2 more reactors would reduce output, with one potentially shutting down temporarily for extended maintenance. The subtext was clear. Without sufficient uranium, France couldn't maintain its nuclear capacity. The engineering team, including Marie, was tasked with developing contingency plans for operating with limited fuel. This meant complex calculations about reactor efficiency, safety margins, and maintenance schedules. Every decision carried enormous consequences for France's energy supply. Sophie's efforts to secure alternative uranium were hitting obstacles at every turn. Australian mining companies demanded long-term contracts at prices 40% higher than what France had paid Niger. Even then, delivery wouldn't begin for 18 months. Uranium traders were taking advantage of France's desperation, driving prices even higher. The crisis exposed how globalized and vulnerable modern industrial systems had become. France's nuclear power program, once a symbol of technological independence, depended entirely on uranium from politically unstable regions. The same globalization that had made French manufacturing competitive through cheap energy was now threatening its survival. As autumn approached, the full scope of France's uranium crisis was becoming clear. This wasn't just a temporary disruption that would resolve with diplomatic negotiations. It was a fundamental challenge to France's energy model and industrial economy that would require years to address fully. 2 months into the uranium crisis, the first major casualty emerged. Pierre Laurent's aluminum factory announced permanent closure after 47 years of operation. The decision came after electricity costs had risen by 35%, making production completely uneconomical. Pierre stood before his remaining 220 workers, many with tears in their eyes, explaining that the company simply couldn't survive. The closure sent shockwaves through the small industrial town of Roussillon. The factory had been the economic anchor for the community, supporting not just direct employees but dozens of local businesses. Restaurant owner Michel Fabre watched his lunch crowd disappear overnight. The hardware store that sold tools and equipment to factory workers faced immediate bankruptcy. Unemployment in the region jumped from 8% to 15% in a single month. Local government officials scrambled to provide retraining programs, but the reality was harsh. There weren't enough alternative jobs for hundreds of displaced industrial workers, especially in a region where other manufacturers were also struggling. Marie Dubois was experiencing her own professional nightmare at the Bougie nuclear plant. EDF had announced that 3 reactors would undergo extended maintenance, a euphemism for indefinite shutdown due to uranium shortages. Marie's department was cut from 8 people to 4, and those remaining faced uncertain futures. The psychological toll on nuclear workers was immense. They had built careers around technology they believed was crucial for France's future. Now, they watched their industry contract in real time. Marie's colleague, Jean-Paul Mercier, a 55-year-old reactor operator, broke down during a team meeting. After 25 years at the plant, he faced the possibility of never finding comparable work again. Sophie Chen at the Marcoule fuel facility was drowning in spreadsheets and supply contracts. Her desperate search for uranium had led to increasingly expensive and complex arrangements. A deal with a Kazakh mining company would provide 800 tons of uranium at prices 60% higher than Niger had charged. Even worse, delivery wouldn't begin for 2 years. Canadian suppliers were demanding upfront payments worth millions of euros before committing to new extraction projects. Australian companies required 20-year contracts at floating prices tied to global market rates. Every alternative to Niger's uranium came with significant financial and logistical challenges. The crisis was reshaping France's entire energy landscape. Renewable energy companies, previously struggling to compete with cheap nuclear power, suddenly found themselves flooded with inquiries. Solar panel installations were booked months in advance. Wind energy projects that had languished in regulatory approval processes were fast-tracked. But renewable energy couldn't replace nuclear baseload power overnight. France's electrical grid needed fundamental restructuring to handle variable renewable inputs. The transition would take years and cost hundreds of billions of euros, all while industrial customers fled to countries with more stable energy supplies. In the Lorraine region, chemical manufacturer BASF announced it would relocate its entire polyethylene production to Germany. The decision affected 340 jobs directly and hundreds more in supporting industries. Plant manager Ingrid Hoffmann explained that energy costs in France were becoming uncompetitive compared to German facilities with access to more diverse energy sources. The automotive industry, crucial to French manufacturing, was also buckling under pressure. PSA Group warned that its Mulhouse engine plant might close if electricity costs continued rising. The facility produced diesel engines for Peugeot and Citroën vehicles, employing 200 people in a region already suffering from industrial decline. Worker representative Bernard Lacroix organized protests outside the plant, but everyone understood the mathematics. French manufacturing had been built on the foundation of cheap nuclear electricity. Without that advantage, production was moving to lower-cost countries. Small businesses throughout France's industrial regions were facing their own crises. In Saint-Nazaire, welding shop owner Pascal Durand saw his electricity bills triple. The high-temperature welding processes essential to his business consumed enormous amounts of power. After 18 years building his company, Pascal faced bankruptcy. His story was repeated thousands of times across France. Small manufacturers, family businesses, and specialized producers that had thrived in the cheap energy environment were suddenly unviable. These companies employed millions of people in communities where alternative work was scarce. The social impact was becoming visible in unemployment offices across industrial France. In Valenciennes, job counselor Catherine Moreau watched her caseload double in 2 months. Former steelworkers, aluminum plant employees, and chemical industry technicians were all seeking help, finding new careers. Many were in their 40s and 50s with specialized skills that didn't translate to other industries. Catherine tried to remain optimistic, promoting retraining programs in renewable energy and digital technologies. But the reality was sobering. A 48-year-old blast furnace operator couldn't easily become a solar panel installer or software developer. The transition required years of education and significant financial sacrifice from families already stressed by unemployment. Meanwhile, in Niger, the effects of the uranium export ban were creating their own human drama. In Arlit, former mining engineer Amadou Hassan watched his town slowly empty as French operations wound down. The hospital where his wife worked as a doctor reduced services due to declining tax revenue from mining operations. The irony wasn't lost on Amadou. Niger was forcing France to find alternative uranium sources, but the economic disruption was hurting ordinary Nigerians who had built lives around the mining industry. The geopolitical chess game between nations had real consequences for families on both continents. French government officials were growing desperate. President Emmanuel Macron dispatched diplomatic missions to Australia, Kazakhstan, and Canada, seeking expedited uranium supply agreements. But mining companies were cautious about rapidly expanding production, remembering previous boom-bust cycles in the uranium market. Energy Minister Agnès Pannier-Runacher announced a new industrial strategy focused on reducing energy intensity in manufacturing. Government subsidies would support companies investing in more efficient technologies. Tax incentives would encourage renewable energy adoption. But these measures would take years to show results. The uranium crisis was forcing France to confront uncomfortable truths about its energy model and economic competitiveness. For decades, cheap nuclear power had masked underlying weaknesses in French industry. Now, with that advantage disappearing, the country faced fundamental questions about its industrial future. Marie, Pierre, and Sophie represented thousands of French workers whose lives had been upended by events in a distant African country. Their personal struggles illustrated how interconnected the modern world had become, and how quickly economic foundations could crumble when global supply chains were disrupted. 6 months after Niger's uranium embargo, the French industrial landscape looked dramatically different. Entire regions that had thrived on energy-intensive manufacturing were becoming rust belts. The human cost was staggering, but individual stories of resilience and adaptation were beginning to emerge from the devastation. Marie Dubois had been laid off from the Bougie nuclear plant after 17 years of service. The plant was operating with minimal staffing as 3 of its 4 reactors remained in extended shutdown. At 34, Marie faced the terrifying prospect of starting over in an entirely different career. Her specialized nuclear engineering knowledge seemed worthless in a job market where employers were cutting energy-intensive operations, but Marie refused to surrender to despair. She enrolled in a retraining program focused on renewable energy systems. The government-sponsored course was designed specifically for displaced nuclear workers, helping them transition their technical skills to wind and solar technologies. The learning curve was steep, and the pay in renewable energy was significantly lower than nuclear work. But Marie was determined to rebuild her career. Her classmates shared similar stories of disruption and adaptation. Jean-Paul Mercier, the 55-year-old reactor operator who had broken down months earlier, was learning to install and maintain wind turbines. The physical demands were challenging for someone his age, but he approached the training with grim determination. His pension wouldn't be sufficient for another 10 years, and his wife's teacher salary couldn't support their household alone. In the small town where Pierre Laurent's aluminum factory had closed, unexpected opportunities were emerging from the economic wreckage. The abandoned factory building was being converted into a logistics center for e-commerce companies. While the new jobs paid less than manufacturing work, they offered employment for some displaced workers. Sylvie Petit, the former quality control technician, found work as a shipping coordinator at the new facility. The job required different skills, but her attention to detail and work ethic transferred well. She earned €400 less monthly than her factory position, forcing difficult family budget decisions, but she was grateful to be employed. More importantly, Sylvie discovered she enjoyed the logistics work. The constant problem-solving and coordination reminded her why she had loved manufacturing quality control. She began studying supply chain management through online courses, hoping to advance to a supervisory role. Pierre himself had made a dramatic career pivot. Instead of wallowing in the factory closure, he used his severance package and savings to purchase a small organic farm outside town. At 52, he was learning sustainable agriculture techniques, growing vegetables for local farmers markets and restaurants. The transition was physically exhausting and financially risky. Pierre's manufacturing management experience didn't prepare him for soil chemistry, crop rotation, or dealing with weather uncertainties. His first harvest was disappointing, and some nights he questioned his decision. But neighboring farmers welcomed him into their community, sharing knowledge and offering support. Sophie Chen's crisis at the Marcoule fuel facility had transformed into an unexpected opportunity. As France scrambled to develop alternative energy sources, her expertise in nuclear fuel cycles became valuable for decommissioning and waste management projects. Instead of managing uranium imports, she was designing systems for safely storing and processing nuclear waste. The work was technically challenging and socially important. France still had 56 nuclear reactors, many approaching end-of-life status. Someone needed to manage the complex process of safely shutting them down and handling radioactive materials. Sophie's specialized knowledge was more valuable than ever, just in a different context. She was also consulted by renewable energy companies trying to understand how to integrate variable wind and solar power with France's remaining nuclear capacity. The technical challenges were fascinating, requiring innovative solutions for grid stability and energy storage. Sophie found herself at the center of France's energy transition, helping design the future electrical system. In the broader economy, the uranium crisis was catalyzing changes that might have taken decades otherwise. French companies were investing heavily in energy efficiency, discovering they could maintain production while using significantly less electricity. Some manufacturers found that forced efficiency improvements actually made them more competitive. Globally, chemical company Rhodia redesigned its entire production process at the Lyon facility, installing waste heat recovery systems and optimizing reaction temperatures. The initial investment was expensive, but electricity consumption dropped by 40% while maintaining the same output. Plant manager Claire Bernard realized they should have made these improvements years earlier. The renewable energy sector was experiencing unprecedented growth. Wind turbine manufacturer Vestas announced plans for a major facility in northern France, taking advantage of newly available industrial sites and a skilled workforce displaced from traditional manufacturing. The plant would employ 800 people, including many former steelworkers and automotive employees. Solar panel installation had become one of France's fastest-growing job sectors. Former construction workers, electricians, and even some displaced factory workers were retraining for solar installation jobs. The work was seasonal and sometimes dangerous, but demand was exploding as both homeowners and businesses sought alternatives to expensive grid electricity. In Niger, the uranium embargo was creating its own complex dynamics. The military government was negotiating with Chinese companies for alternative mining partnerships, but these deals were proceeding slowly. Meanwhile, communities around Arlit and Imuraren were struggling economically as French operations wound down. Aissatou Mamadou, the nurse at Arlit's hospital, had decided to relocate to Niger's capital, Niamey, where healthcare opportunities were better. The uranium mining region's economy was contracting, and young professionals were leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The hospital where she worked had reduced services as tax revenue from mining operations declined. But some Nigerians saw opportunity in the crisis. Small-scale miners were organizing cooperatives to extract uranium using more labor-intensive methods. While these operations couldn't match the scale of French industrial mining, they kept some uranium flowing to international markets while providing local employment. Back in France, communities were discovering resilience they didn't know they possessed. The town where Pierre's factory had closed organized a local currency system to keep commerce flowing despite unemployment. Residents traded services and goods using local credits, reducing dependence on euros that were increasingly scarce. Local food production was expanding as people like Pierre switched to agriculture. Abandoned industrial sites were being converted to urban farms and renewable energy installations. The forced economic transition was painful, but it was also creating more localized, sustainable economic models. Marie's renewable energy training was progressing well. She discovered that her nuclear plant experience with complex safety systems and precise monitoring translated well to managing wind farm operations. The technology was different, but the mindset of careful attention to technical details was identical. By winter, Marie had secured a position with a wind energy company installing turbines across southern France. The work required travel and irregular hours, but she was using her engineering background again. Her salary was lower than nuclear work, but the industry was growing rapidly with opportunities for advancement. The uranium crisis was revealing that economic resilience often came from unexpected sources. Communities that seemed devastated were finding ways to adapt and rebuild. Workers whose skills seemed obsolete were discovering new applications for their experience. The transition was difficult and ongoing, but human creativity and determination were creating possibilities nobody had anticipated. 1 year after the uranium embargo began, France was emerging as a fundamentally different country. The crisis that had initially seemed like an economic disaster was driving innovations and transformations that positioned France as a leader. In Europe's energy transition, Marie Dubois stood atop a wind turbine in Provence 80 meters above the Mediterranean coastline, performing routine maintenance on the massive generator. The former nuclear plant worker had completed her renewable energy certification and was now managing operations for a wind farm that powered 50,000 homes. Her technical background in nuclear systems had translated perfectly to the complex engineering challenges of wind power generation. The work was different from her climate-controlled nuclear plant environment. She faced wind, rain, and challenging physical demands climbing turbine towers. But Marie felt energized by the visible impact of her work. Unlike nuclear power, where uranium fuel was hidden inside reactor vessels, she could see wind turbines, generating clean electricity across the landscape. Her salary had initially dropped when she left nuclear work, but rapid growth in renewable energy was driving wages higher. Marie had been promoted twice in 8 months, now supervising a team of 12 technicians across 3 wind farms. The French government's massive investment in renewable energy was creating opportunities she never could have imagined in the shrinking nuclear sector. Pierre Laurent's organic farm had evolved from desperation into genuine success. His vegetables were supplying 3 high-end restaurants in nearby Lyon, and he had contracts with 2 grocery chains for organic produce. The transition from aluminum factory manager to farmer had been difficult, but Pierre discovered he loved the connection between his work and the natural world. More importantly, his farm employed 8 seasonal workers, many of them former factory employees from the closed aluminum plant. Instead of contributing to unemployment, Pierre was creating jobs for his former colleagues. The work was seasonal and weather-dependent, but it provided income and purpose for people who had felt abandoned by industrial decline. Pierre had also installed solar panels across his farm buildings, generating enough electricity to power his operations and sell surplus back to the grid. The former factory manager was now a small-scale energy producer, contributing to France's renewable transition while building a sustainable business. Sophie Chen had become one of France's most sought-after experts in energy transition planning. Her experience with nuclear fuel cycles was invaluable for managing the complex process of decommissioning reactors while maintaining grid stability. The French government had appointed her to lead a national task force on nuclear waste management and renewable energy integration. Sophie's work involved coordinating with utility companies, renewable energy developers, and local communities to plan France's energy future. The technical challenges were enormous. Replacing reliable nuclear baseload power with variable renewable sources required sophisticated grid management and energy storage systems. But Sophie thrived on the complexity. She was helping design battery storage facilities, pumped hydro systems, and smart grid technologies that would allow France to operate with 80% renewable electricity by 2035. The uranium crisis had forced France to accelerate energy transition, plans by at least a decade, creating opportunities for technical innovation. The broader French economy was adapting in ways nobody had predicted. Energy-intensive industries that had seemed doomed were discovering they could operate profitably with higher electricity costs by implementing dramatic efficiency improvements. Some were actually becoming more competitive internationally as they reduced waste and optimized processes. The aluminum industry, which had been devastated by the uranium crisis, was making a comeback using recycled materials rather than energy-intensive primary smelting. New facilities were designed around efficiency and renewable energy, employing fewer people but creating more sustainable jobs. Chemical manufacturer BASF, which had initially threatened to leave France, instead invested €200 million in process innovations that reduced electricity consumption by 60%. Plant manager Ingrid Hoffman explained that the uranium crisis had forced efficiency improvements that made the facility more competitive than sister plants in Germany and Belgium. Small businesses were also discovering unexpected resilience. Pascal Durand, the welding shop owner who had faced bankruptcy due to rising electricity costs, partnered with a renewable energy company to provide specialized welding services for wind turbine construction. His expertise in precision metalwork was perfect for manufacturing turbine components. Pascal's business was now thriving, employing 12 people instead of the original 4. The renewable energy boom created demand for specialized manufacturing, skills that had seemed obsolete. His welding shop was working at capacity, with contracts extending 2 years into the future. The social transformation was equally dramatic. Communities that had been devastated by factory closures were rebuilding around new economic models. The town where Pierre's aluminum plant had closed was now home to a wind turbine blade manufacturing facility, a solar panel assembly plant, and several renewable energy service companies. Unemployment in the region had fallen from its crisis peak of 15% to 8%, lower than before the uranium embargo. The new jobs often required different skills and paid differently than traditional manufacturing, but they offered long-term security in growing industries. Sylvie Petit had been promoted to logistics manager at the e-commerce facility that replaced Pierre's factory. She was also studying renewable energy project management through online courses, preparing for opportunities in France's expanding clean energy sector. Her teenage children were planning university studies in environmental engineering and sustainable technology, careers that barely existed when the uranium crisis began. In Niger, the uranium situation was stabilizing around new arrangements. Chinese mining companies had begun operations under partnerships with the military government, providing Niger with better revenue terms than previous French agreements. The transition was creating different employment patterns, but economic activity in the mining regions was gradually recovering. Aissatou Mamadou, who had moved to Niamey when the French uranium operations wound down, was working with international health organizations on medical programs for former mining communities. Her experience as a nurse in Arlit made her valuable for addressing healthcare needs related to uranium mining's environmental impacts. The geopolitical implications were significant. France's forced diversification away from African uranium was reducing its dependence on potentially unstable suppliers. Australian and Canadian uranium suppliers had expanded production capacity, creating more reliable long-term partnerships. France was also developing small modular reactor technologies that used uranium more efficiently. Most importantly, France's renewable energy capacity was expanding rapidly. Wind and solar installations were exceeding all previous projections. As communities and businesses sought alternatives to expensive grid electricity, energy storage technology was advancing quickly, supported by government investment and private innovation. Marie's wind farm was part of a network of renewable installations across southern France that could collectively provide baseload power, equivalent to 2 nuclear reactors. Advanced weather forecasting and grid management systems allowed operators to predict and balance renewable energy output with remarkable precision. The uranium crisis had forced France to confront the vulnerabilities of its energy model, but the response was creating a more resilient and sustainable economy. Workers like Marie, Pierre, and Sophie were not just adapting to change. They were leading transformations that positioned France as a model for energy transition. By the first anniversary of Niger's uranium embargo, France had reduced its dependence on nuclear power from 70% to 55% of electricity generation, with renewable sources making up the difference. The transition was ongoing, but the trajectory was clear. France was building an energy system that was more diverse, more sustainable, and ultimately more secure than the uranium-dependent model it was replacing. 2 years after Niger's uranium embargo shocked France into an energy transition, the transformation was complete enough to evaluate its lasting impact. What had begun as an economic crisis had evolved into one of Europe's most successful examples of rapid decarbonization and industrial adaptation. Marie Dubois now managed renewable energy operations across 3 French regions, overseeing 200 wind turbines and 15 solar installations that collectively generated power for 300,000 homes. Her career trajectory from nuclear plant worker to renewable energy executive illustrated how crisis could create unexpected opportunities for professional growth. Standing in the control room of France's largest offshore wind farm, Marie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The technology was more sophisticated than anything she had worked with in nuclear power. Advanced algorithms predicted weather patterns days in advance, optimizing turbine positioning and energy storage to maintain grid stability. Marie's team included former nuclear workers, oil and gas engineers, and recent graduates in renewable energy technology. The diversity of backgrounds created a dynamic work environment where traditional industrial expertise merged with cutting-edge clean technology innovation. Her salary now exceeded what she had earned at the nuclear plant, and the industry offered clear advancement opportunities. France's renewable energy sector employed over 400,000 people, making it one of the country's largest employers. The uranium crisis had forced the creation of an entirely new industrial ecosystem. Pierre Laurent's organic farm had evolved into something he never could have imagined during his factory management days. His 50-hectare operation supplied vegetables to restaurants across Lyon and Marseille, but it had also become a model for sustainable agriculture that attracted visitors from across Europe. Pierre had installed an extensive solar array that generated 3 times more electricity than his farm consumed, making him a significant contributor to the local grid. His battery storage system allowed him to provide power during peak demand periods, earning premium rates that supplemented his farming income. More importantly, Pierre's farm employed 25 people year-round, many of them former industrial workers, who had discovered satisfaction in agriculture. His operation included a small processing facility for organic foods, a farm-to-table restaurant, and an educational center where urban French children learned about sustainable food production. The psychological transformation was as significant as the economic one. Pierre had gone from managing a polluting industrial process that depended on cheap energy to creating a business that actually improved environmental conditions while providing healthy food. The sense of purpose was something he had never experienced in manufacturing. Sophie Chen had become France's leading expert on integrated energy systems, consulting for governments across Europe on energy transition strategies. Her experience managing the uranium crisis response had made her invaluable for countries seeking to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and nuclear power. Sophie's current project involved designing Europe's most advanced smart grid system, connecting renewable energy installations across 5 countries to balance supply and demand. The technical challenges were enormous, requiring real-time coordination of thousands of wind turbines, solar farms, and energy storage facilities across national borders. The work represented the cutting edge of energy technology. Sophie was helping create systems that could predict renewable energy output, weeks in advance and automatically adjust consumption patterns to match available supply. The technology was revolutionary, making variable renewable energy as reliable as traditional baseload power. Her team included engineers from across Europe, creating an international collaboration that shared knowledge and accelerated innovation. The uranium crisis had forced France to develop expertise that was now valuable globally, creating export opportunities for French technology and consulting services. The broader French economy had been transformed by the energy transition. Manufacturing had become more efficient and competitive as companies adopted advanced technologies to reduce energy consumption. France was now a leader in energy-efficient industrial processes, with companies like Rhodia licensing their innovations to manufacturers worldwide. The automotive industry had pivoted successfully to electric vehicle production, taking advantage of France's expanding renewable electricity generation. PSA Group's Mulhouse plant, which had faced closure during the uranium crisis, now produced electric motors for vehicles sold across Europe and exported to Africa and Asia. Small businesses had also thrived in the new energy economy. Pascal Durand's welding company had grown into a 50-person manufacturing operation specializing in renewable energy infrastructure. His precision metalwork was essential for wind turbine construction, solar panel mounting systems, and energy storage facilities. Pascal had established training programs that taught welding skills specifically for renewable energy applications. Former steelworkers, automotive employees, and even some nuclear plant workers had retrained at his facility, finding new careers in the expanding clean energy sector. The social transformation was equally profound. Communities that had been devastated by factory closures were now thriving economic centers for renewable energy industries. The Rhone Valley, once dependent on energy-intensive manufacturing, had become Europe's largest concentration of clean technology companies. Unemployment in former industrial regions had fallen to historic lows as renewable energy companies competed for skilled workers. Wages in the clean energy sector were rising rapidly, driven by demand for technical expertise and the need to attract workers from traditional industries. Sylvie Petit exemplified the successful transition many workers had made. She was now operations manager for a company that developed energy storage systems for renewable installations. Her attention to detail and process management skills, honed in aluminum manufacturing, were perfect for ensuring battery systems operated safely and efficiently. Sylvie's teenage children were studying renewable energy engineering at university, preparing for careers in an industry that hadn't existed during their mother's factory days. The family had not only recovered from the industrial transition, but was more prosperous than ever. In Niger, the uranium situation had stabilized around more equitable arrangements. Chinese mining operations provided better revenue terms for the government, and new healthcare and education investments were visible in mining communities. The disruption had been difficult, but it ultimately led to better outcomes for ordinary Nigerians. Aissatou Mamadou had returned to Arlit as director of a new regional hospital, funded by improved mining revenues. The facility provided healthcare, services that weren't available during French uranium operations, including specialist treatment for mining-related health issues. The geopolitical implications of France's energy transition were significant. Reduced dependence on uranium imports had strengthened France's energy security and foreign policy independence. The country was now a technology leader in renewable energy, exporting expertise and equipment to developing countries seeking to build clean energy systems. France's success had inspired similar transitions across Europe. Germany accelerated its renewable energy programs. Spain invested heavily in solar technology. Italy developed advanced energy storage systems. The uranium crisis had catalyzed a continental shift towards sustainable energy that might have taken decades otherwise. Most remarkably, France's carbon emissions had fallen by 35% in 2 years, the fastest decarbonization rate of any developed country. The forced transition from uranium-dependent nuclear power to renewable energy had achieved environmental goals that seemed impossible under normal economic conditions. Marie's wind farm was now part of a network that provided 60% of France's electricity from renewable sources. Advanced grid management systems balanced supply and demand so effectively that blackouts had become rare, despite the variable nature of wind and solar power. On quiet evenings at the wind farm, Marie often watched the sun set behind the rotating turbine blades, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. The uranium crisis had seemed like a disaster, but it had forced France to build a better energy system. The transformation wasn't complete. France still operated nuclear reactors and imported some fossil fuels. But the trajectory was clear. Within another decade, France would be powered almost entirely by renewable energy, with an industrial economy that was more efficient, more sustainable, and more resilient than ever before. The human stories of Marie, Pierre, Sophie, and thousands of other French workers proved that economic transitions, however painful initially, could create opportunities for individuals and communities to build better lives. The uranium crisis had ended, but the innovations and transformations it sparked would shape France's economy for generations to come.